Imagine watching an NFL referee stop a game because there are 5 minutes left on the clock. He grabs the microphone, lectures both teams about fairness, about stability, about how changing the rules too close to the end would create chaos for the players and confusion for the fans. Everybody nods. Everybody accepts it. Then 1 week later, same referee, same stadium, same rulebook, except this time, his favorite team is losing, and suddenly he runs onto the field with 30 seconds left and changes the rules anyway. Not quietly either, not subtly. Right there in front of millions of people while pretending nothing strange is happening at all. That is basically what the United States Supreme Court just did in Alabama. And the terrifying part is not even the hypocrisy anymore. The terrifying part is how comfortable they seem doing it in broad daylight, because this is no longer just another dry legal fight over congressional maps or election procedures. This is a stress test for whether Americans still believe the rules apply equally depending on whose political power is at stake. This is about whether the highest court in the country is still acting like a court, or whether it has started operating like a political emergency room for the Republican Party whenever elections are on the line. Last week, the conservative majority on the Supreme Court cleared the way for Alabama Republicans to move forward with congressional maps that could eliminate one of the state's 2 majority black districts just days before the primary election. Let that sink in for a second. Days, not months, not half a year, days. And if that sounds familiar, it should, because this same court spent years hiding behind something called the Purcell Principle, a legal doctrine basically saying courts should avoid changing election rules too close to an election because it risks confusion and instability. Funny how instability only matters sometimes. 3 years ago, when Alabama was ordered to redraw discriminatory maps after a major Voting Rights Act ruling, the Supreme Court said it was too close to the election to implement changes even with months remaining before voting. Months were apparently dangerous. Months threatened democracy. Months were unacceptable. But now, 1 week before a primary, suddenly the court acts like timing is irrelevant. Suddenly the emergency is not voter confusion. The emergency is making sure Republicans keep political control before midterms reshape the House battlefield. And here's where this story stops being legal theory and starts becoming something uglier. Because Alabama is not alone. Tennessee Republicans already carved up Memphis, one of the most historically significant black political communities in America, splitting it apart across multiple districts in a move critics say was designed to erase the last Democratic congressional seat in the state, Memphis, the city where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, the city deeply tied to the modern civil rights movement. That city is now being politically dissected on a map like pieces of property at an estate auction. And while all this is happening, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson is practically waving a flare gun from inside the Supreme Court itself, warning Americans that the conservative majority is abusing emergency powers and shredding its own standards in real time. But notice what the conservative justices are not explaining. They are not explaining why 4 months before an election was once too dangerous for map changes. But 7 days is apparently perfectly fine now. Because once you ask that question out loud, the whole performance starts collapsing instantly. Because this is the part nobody inside the conservative majority wants to say plainly. The Purcell Principle was never supposed to be a magic trick. It was sold to the American public as a neutral safeguard, a doctrine designed to prevent courts from creating election chaos too close to voting. Neutral, consistent, institutional. Those were the words. That was the branding. But once you compare the timeline in Alabama to what is happening now in Louisiana, the entire thing starts looking less like constitutional restraint and more like a referee swallowing his whistle, depending on which sideline is screaming louder. And Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson saw it immediately. In the Louisiana case, the conservative justices didn't just move quickly. They bypassed the court's normal 32-day waiting period and rushed the ruling into effect almost immediately, while early voting was already underway. Think about how extraordinary that is. The same institution that spent years warning America that changing election procedures too close to voting could damage public confidence suddenly decided public confidence was no longer a concern. Why? What changed? The Constitution did not change. The legal standard did not change. The only thing that changed was who benefited politically from the timing. That is the question sitting like a loaded weapon in the middle of this entire controversy. And when Jackson called out the contradiction, Justice Samuel Alito reacted like somebody had exposed the trick during the magic show. He fired back in a separate opinion, accusing her of making unfair accusations, claiming her criticism was baseless and lacked restraint. But here's what makes this exchange so revealing. Alito spent more energy sounding offended than explaining the inconsistency itself. Notice what never appears in these angry responses from the conservative bloc. A clear answer, a coherent principle, a logical framework that explains why 4 months before an election once justified judicial paralysis, while 7 days before an election now justifies judicial intervention. Because there isn't one. And Americans can feel that instinctively, even if they've never read a Supreme Court opinion in their lives. You don't need a law degree to recognize selective enforcement. Every ordinary person understands the unfairness of rules that magically bend for the powerful. If a teacher punished one student for turning homework in 2 minutes late, but let another student rewrite the entire assignment after grades were posted, nobody would call that neutrality. They would call it favoritism. Yet somehow, when the Supreme Court does it, Americans are expected to treat it like sacred constitutional complexity beyond public criticism. No, that shield is gone now. Especially when the real-world consequences are this obvious. Because these maps are not abstract lines floating in legal textbooks. They determine whose communities stay politically united and whose communities get shattered into pieces. In Tennessee, Memphis was carved apart and attached to wealthy Republican suburbs stretching toward areas like Williamson County, one of the richest counties in America. That was not an accident of geography. That was political engineering. The objective was painfully transparent. Dilute black voting power, eliminate Democratic representation, and restructure the battlefield before voters even enter the booth. And the moral ugliness becomes impossible to ignore once you remember the historical backdrop here. Memphis is not just another southern city. This is where Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated supporting striking sanitation workers. This is sacred ground in the history of American civil rights. Yet now the same city is being split apart through legal mechanisms defended with sterile procedural language by politicians pretending race has absolutely nothing to do with any of it. That may honestly be the most insulting part of the entire performance. Not just the map manipulation itself, the gaslighting afterward. Because listen carefully to how Republican lawmakers talk about these maps. They almost always retreat into the same sanitized language. Communities of interest, redistricting adjustments, political geography. They speak about neighborhoods the way insurance companies speak about flood damage, cold, technical, emotionally disconnected from the human beings underneath the paperwork. But then somebody like Holly McCall comes forward and says the quiet part out loud. Memphis was deliberately fractured. Black political power was deliberately diluted. And suddenly the conversation becomes uncomfortable because now we are no longer arguing over legal terminology. Now we are staring directly at intent. And intent is where this entire thing starts collapsing morally. Because nobody accidentally splits one of the most historically important Black political communities in America into multiple Republican-heavy districts, stretching deep into wealthy white suburbs. That doesn't happen by coincidence. Maps like that are designed the same way military operations are designed. Every line serves a purpose. Every county attachment serves a purpose. Every demographic calculation serves a purpose. The objective is not hidden. The objective is victory before a single vote is cast. That's why this story is bigger than Alabama, bigger than Tennessee, bigger than Louisiana. This is about whether elections themselves are slowly becoming pre-engineered products, where outcomes are increasingly shaped long before Election Day arrives. Americans are taught that democracy begins when citizens enter the voting booth. But modern power understands something much more important. If you control the districts, the timelines, the court interventions, and the emergency rulings, you can shape the battlefield itself before voters ever touch a ballot. And once people start believing the battlefield is rigged, public trust starts bleeding out everywhere else too. That is the danger the conservative justices keep pretending not to see, or worse, the danger they understand perfectly well. Because the Supreme Court is supposed to be the one institution standing above electoral warfare. It is supposed to function like the emergency brake, protecting constitutional consistency, no matter which party benefits politically. Instead, what Americans increasingly see is a court that sounds deeply committed to judicial restraint right up until Republican electoral power becomes vulnerable. Then suddenly the restraint disappears. Suddenly the emergency docket explodes into action. Suddenly deadlines become flexible. Suddenly principles become negotiable. And every single time that happens, institutional legitimacy takes another hit. You can already hear it in ordinary conversations now. People are no longer debating whether courts are conservative or liberal. Americans have always argued about ideology. What's changing now is darker, more corrosive, more dangerous. Increasingly, people are questioning whether outcomes are predetermined by partisan loyalty before arguments are even heard. Once a population starts viewing judges the same way they view political operatives, the judiciary enters catastrophic territory because courts do not possess armies, wealth, or police power. Their authority depends almost entirely on public belief in fairness. That belief is what's eroding in real time. And maybe the clearest example of that erosion is the reaction to Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson herself. Notice how aggressively the conservative bloc reacted when she challenged their procedural inconsistency, not just disagreement, personal outrage. Samuel Alito practically sounded insulted that someone would publicly accuse the court of selectively applying standards. But what exactly did Jackson do besides compare the court's current behavior to its own past rulings? That's the devastating part. Her criticism hit so hard because it used the court's own language against them. No conspiracy theory, no dramatic fabrication, just timelines, just receipts, just the court's own previous logic laid side by side against what it is doing now. And when institutions cannot survive direct comparison to their own standards, that is usually the moment legitimacy begins cracking from the inside out. And history tells us something brutally simple about moments like this. Democracies rarely collapse because one side suddenly announces the end of democracy. That almost never happens. Democracies decay when institutions slowly teach citizens that fairness is conditional, that rules are flexible, and that power matters more than consistency. Eventually, people stop expecting neutrality altogether. They stop believing courts are referees. They start seeing them as players wearing striped uniforms while secretly taking instructions from the sidelines. That is the psychological shift happening right now in America. Because if the Purcell Principle can be rigid when black voting power is protected, but suddenly elastic when Republican electoral maps are threatened, then Americans are not looking at constitutional consistency anymore. They are looking at selective enforcement wrapped in legal language, sophisticated enough to survive cable news interviews. And the longer the court refuses to confront that contradiction, honestly, the worse the damage becomes. Especially for black voters in the South. Think about the message being sent here. In Alabama, Louisiana, and Tennessee, communities that already spent generations fighting literacy tests, voter intimidation, racial gerrymandering, and Jim Crow restrictions are now watching the modern version unfold through emergency court orders and district maps. No governor is standing in a schoolhouse doorway anymore. Nobody is holding segregation signs on courthouse steps. The machinery evolved. It got cleaner, more polished, more procedural. But the outcome many critics fear remains hauntingly familiar, reducing the political influence of black voters before ballots are even cast. And once you see that pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee it. That is why Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson matters so much in this story. Not because she is magically going to reverse every conservative ruling tomorrow morning, but because she is one of the few voices inside the institution openly documenting the contradiction while it is happening. Her dissents are starting to read less like ordinary legal disagreements and more like historical records written in real time for future generations. Almost like she understands something many people in Washington still refuse to admit. Public trust, once shattered, is almost impossible to rebuild. And that is the real crisis underneath all of this. Not just congressional maps, not just partisan advantage, not even just the Supreme Court itself. The real crisis is whether ordinary Americans will continue believing the system applies equally regardless of race, geography, or political affiliation. Because the second citizens conclude that constitutional principles only activate depending on which party benefits, the entire moral authority of the judiciary starts collapsing inward. At that point, the court may still issue rulings, it may still wear robes, it may still hold ceremonies and publish opinions. But its legitimacy becomes increasingly performative, increasingly fragile, increasingly dependent on raw power instead of public confidence. And no republic survives that forever. So when people dismiss these map fights as boring procedural politics, they are missing the entire point. This is not really about lines on paper. It is about who gets heard, who gets diluted, who gets protected, and who gets told to wait patiently while the rules change around them yet again. Because here is the question hanging over this entire country tonight. If the rules only remain sacred when they protect the powerful, are they still rules at all? Or are Americans watching the gradual transformation of the Supreme Court into something far more dangerous, a political institution with constitutional branding? That question is not going away anytime soon, and neither should public outrage. If you believe the American people deserve equal rules, equal standards, and a Supreme Court that applies constitutional principles consistently no matter which party wins or loses, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Share this video with somebody who still thinks these are just routine legal disputes, and drop a comment below. Do you believe the Supreme Court is still acting like an independent court, or has it started acting like another political branch of government?